the evening dragged on slowly, as if the clock itself had decided to mock my silent loneliness amidst all the celebration. Our spacious living room was crowded with friends, colleagues, and casual acquaintances, mingling effortlessly, their laughter rising and falling in gentle waves. I moved gracefully among them, smiling politely, aware of the delicate touch of silk sliding softly against my skin, accentuating every subtle curve of my body. I had chosen this dress carefully, hoping silently that my husband would pause just for a moment, look at me and remember the woman he married. Yet as always, his attention remained firmly fixed elsewhere, on his guests, their discussions, or the expensive wine swirling gently in his glass. From the large windows, the city lights blinked quietly in the distance, as though whispering promises of another life just beyond my reach. Standing alone by the terrace doors, I felt profoundly isolated, surrounded yet unnoticed. It wasn't unhappiness exactly, but rather a deep longing for something my marriage lacked. Not stability, not security, not even companionship, but desire. I longed desperately to feel seen again, truly seen as a woman desirable and alive, not merely as a gracious hostess or an accessory at my husband's side. I stepped outside onto the terrace, the cool evening air gently brushing against my bare shoulders, raising tiny goosebumps along my arms. From here, the muffled laughter inside felt distant, a faint echo of a world I inhabited only superficially. I closed my eyes, savoring this brief moment of solitude, when suddenly, I sensed another presence approaching quietly behind me. Without turning, I knew exactly who it was. My husband's closest friend, someone who had, over the years, become an almost permanent fixture in our lives. He stood close, not touching, yet near enough that I felt the warmth of his body radiating gently towards mine. "You look cold," he murmured softly, removing his jacket and placing it tenderly around my shoulders. His fingers brushed against my bare skin, just long enough to send a slow ripple of warmth through my entire body. I smiled slightly, thanking him without turning around, fearing my face would betray the sudden acceleration of my heartbeat. He lingered silently beside me, his presence comforting and yet dangerously thrilling. Our silence held an unspoken tension, the quiet spaces between our breaths filling with words neither of us dared say. Eventually he stepped away, leaving me with a strange emptiness, as though something had been taken from me that I'd never even realized I needed. When I rejoined the guests inside, everything felt different. Each time our eyes met across the crowded room, I experienced a fluttering inside my chest, a quickening of pulse I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't casual, he was deliberately seeking my gaze, holding it just a fraction longer each time, as if silently trying to communicate something profound, something forbidden yet undeniably magnetic. As the evening ended and guests slowly departed, my husband drifted to sleep in an armchair, exhausted and content. I covered him gently with a blanket, studying his familiar features in the soft glow of the lamps. Once, the sight of his sleeping face had been reassuring, a symbol of safety and home. Tonight, though, it evoked a hollow sadness, reminding me of all the quiet distances between us. My husband's friend was the last to leave. At the door, as we exchanged polite goodbyes, he hesitated briefly, then gently reached out, taking my hand lightly in his. It was the faintest touch, yet it resonated deeply within me, awakening something I'd carefully kept buried. "You deserve so much more," he whispered softly, his eyes locked onto mine. Before I could respond, he released my hand, disappearing quickly into the night. I stood motionless at the threshold, feeling the lingering sensation of his touch on my fingertips, replaying his words over and over. Eventually, I returned to my husband, still peacefully sleeping, and climbed into bed beside him, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. My mind was restless, recalling every subtle detail of the evening. His gaze, his warmth, the quiet promise hidden in his voice. In the silent darkness of the room, I acknowledged for the first time the undeniable truth. A boundary had been crossed tonight, one I knew I couldn't uncross. Strangely, I realized that I didn't want to. Morning arrived gently, sunlight spilling through the bedroom curtains in warm, golden pools. Despite the brightness, my thoughts remained clouded, tangled in memories of the previous night. I lay awake, quietly listening to my husband's slow, rhythmic breathing beside me. The peacefulness of his sleep stood in stark contrast to my restless heart. A strange sensation lingered inside me, something akin to anticipation mixed with guilt, a tension rooted deep beneath my skin, refusing to fade. My husband stirred slightly, then turned over without waking. I watched him silently, struck by how unfamiliar he felt to me in that moment. It wasn't a lack of love, I still cared deeply, but an emptiness had formed between us, subtle yet undeniable. We shared a life, a home, and countless routines, yet lately our conversations had become shallow exchanges, predictable and devoid of real connection. I realized what I missed most was intimacy, not necessarily physical but the emotional intimacy, the passion of truly feeling seen. After breakfast, as I was finishing my coffee in the sunlit kitchen, my husband mentioned casually that he needed me to go ahead to our lake house to prepare for the weekend's gathering. He had a critical business meeting and wouldn't be able to accompany me until later. Before I could respond, he added calmly that his best friend had already agreed to drive me there. My heart skipped a beat and I struggled to hide the rush of excitement mixed with anxiety. With forced indifference, I nodded and walked slowly toward the bedroom, my heart pounding heavily against my chest. I spent more time than usual preparing myself, carefully selecting clothes that felt simultaneously casual and effortlessly alluring. Beneath my favorite cashmere sweater dress, I chose delicate lingerie, intricate lace, the kind I usually reserved for special occasions. It was strange to admit even to myself that I dressed not for my husband's arrival later, but for the short journey ahead with his friend. When I finally stepped outside, he was already waiting beside his car, leaning comfortably against the passenger door. His confident posture sent a subtle shiver down my spine. His eyes briefly traveled over me with quiet appreciation, a gesture that sent warmth spreading through my chest. He opened the car door and I slid inside, suddenly aware of how close the seats felt, the intimate space almost electrified by his presence. During the first minutes, our conversation stayed safe, mundane. A commentary on traffic, weather, small events from the previous evening. But gradually, the silence between our words began to fill with something far more potent, an electric awareness neither of us acknowledged aloud, yet both unmistakably felt. Each stolen glance seemed to reveal unspoken thoughts, charged with hidden desires and mutual curiosity. Halfway through the drive, he turned off the main road onto a quieter route, explaining briefly that it was shorter. Tall trees lined the winding path, their branches casting soft shadows that danced rhythmically over us as we moved forward. The intimacy of this secluded road deepened my anticipation. I found myself acutely conscious of his closeness, noticing every detail, the gentle movement of his hands on the steering wheel, the subtle scent of his cologne blending with the fresh countryside air drifting in through open windows. Without warning, he slowed the car, pulling off gently onto a secluded shoulder shaded by towering trees. My pulse quickened instantly. Neither of us moved at first, silence stretching taut between us. When he finally turned toward me, his expression was tender yet determined, eyes searching mine deeply, quietly asking for permission. I didn't speak but made no move to resist. Slowly, hesitantly, he leaned in, brushing a gentle, tentative kiss onto my lips. The softness and warmth of his mouth ignited a rush of sensations I'd almost forgotten existed. It wasn't simply desire. It was the profound realization of feeling wanted, truly seen and deeply understood. For those few precious seconds, my entire world condensed to the warmth of his lips on mine, his breath mingling intimately with my own. When we finally parted, both breathing unsteadily, the silence that returned was different. No longer cautious but honest, unapologetic, filled with shared understanding. We continued the drive in near complete silence, but everything between us had shifted. I leaned back, closing my eyes briefly, heart pounding wildly. My fingers unconsciously touched my lips, as though tracing the invisible imprint he'd left behind. Guilt mixed uncomfortably with exhilaration, and yet I felt no regret. That brief, forbidden kiss awakened something buried deep within me, a yearning for connection and passion long denied. Arriving at the quiet, sunlit cabin, I stepped out of the car on unsteady legs, still feeling the ghostly warmth of his touch. He quietly helped carry my bags inside, his movements careful, controlled, yet filled with restrained intensity. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but firm, heavy with emotion. "We can't ignore this." I met his gaze directly, knowing exactly what he meant, yet unwilling to speak aloud what we both now knew. He paused briefly, then offered a faint, reassuring smile, leaving me alone with the echoes of his touch and the chaos of emotions it had unleashed within me. As the car drove away, leaving me standing quietly before the cabin, I knew something significant had changed irrevocably. Now there was no turning back. From the moment my husband arrived at the lakeside house that evening, the careful calm I'd been holding on to began to fray at the edges. His cheerful greetings and casual talk about his day did nothing but deepen the unsettling feeling that had taken root inside me since the kiss. I smiled mechanically as he recounted another successful meeting, all the while silently grappling with the confusion that consumed me from within. Earlier, as I prepared for his arrival, my hands moved absently through familiar routines. I carefully selected a deep burgundy lace lingerie set, something new, something daring. The rich fabric hugged my skin intimately, whispering promises I wasn't sure I should be making. My reflection stared back from the mirror, a woman simultaneously excited by the lingering memories of another man's touch and burdened by an intensifying sense of guilt. It felt surreal choosing something so intimately sensual not for my husband, but for the quiet, smoldering desire I felt for another man. By evening, my sister appeared unexpectedly at our doorstep, warmly embracing me. Her visits usually filled the house with laughter and comfort, but tonight something shifted almost immediately. She studied me carefully, her eyes narrowing slightly as though reading a secret etched onto my face. I found myself struggling under her penetrating gaze, suddenly terrified that she'd sense my turmoil. Each time our eyes met, I felt as though she could see straight through the carefully constructed facade of calm I'd erected, sensing the cracks in the facade of my supposed marital happiness. Not long afterward, my husband's best friend joined us again for dinner, and my heart quickened instantly upon seeing him. He moved quietly around the room, his familiar charm slightly subdued, almost deliberately distant, though our eyes frequently met in unguarded moments. Each glance lasted a fraction longer than appropriate, stirring something within me that I struggled desperately to contain. I watched him carefully, acutely aware of how his presence filled every inch of space, making me vividly aware of my body's silent reactions, the subtle flush in my cheeks, the quickened rhythm of my breathing. Throughout the meal, an invisible tension hovered between the four of us, a quiet turbulence hidden beneath polite smiles and casual conversation. At one moment, as I reached across the table, my fingers unintentionally brushed his hand. It was brief, accidental, yet the shock of electricity that surged through me was so powerful that I quickly withdrew, barely managing to mask my surprise. Glancing up, I caught my sister watching carefully, a thoughtful expression crossing her features before she quickly returned to her meal. Her silent observation unnerved me deeply. My sister was perceptive, often sensing truths I barely admitted to myself. I wondered anxiously if she noticed the subtle interplay between me and my husband's closest friend. Each time our eyes connected, each small gesture carried weight, tension coiling tighter and tighter within my chest. After dinner, as we moved to the living room, my husband excused himself briefly, stepping out to answer yet another phone call. Left alone with my sister and his friend, the atmosphere grew thick with unspoken thoughts. My sister's eyes, usually warm and carefree, were now guarded, carefully reading my every movement. When my gaze inadvertently returned to his, she caught it, her expression shifting in an instant from casual ease to guarded curiosity, quietly sensing that something significant lingered unsaid. She didn't speak, but the subtle narrowing of her eyes told me enough. My secret, or at least some hidden part of it, was no longer mine alone. My pulse quickened again, a painful mixture of fear and anticipation tightening in my throat. The realization that my careful facade was beginning to crack overwhelmed me with anxiety. I had not yet even begun to process my own desires fully, and now another person was dangerously close to discovering my hidden truths. When my husband returned, oblivious to the charged air in the room, the conversation resumed its polite superficiality. Soon afterward, my sister rose to leave, giving me a lingering, meaningful look as she hugged me goodbye. In that momentary embrace, I felt her silent warning, her quiet awareness heavy upon my shoulders. That night, as my husband slept peacefully beside me, my mind raced through the day's events over and over. The darkness around me seemed suffocating, filled with invisible currents of unspoken truths. Despite the guilt gnawing at my conscience, I found myself thinking of another's touch, gentle yet firm, fleeting yet unforgettable. and realized with a sinking certainty that this was only the beginning of a much deeper, more complicated journey than I had anticipated. The days following that charged dinner passed in a restless blur. Each mundane task became increasingly difficult, as I found myself perpetually distracted by thoughts of him. The soft brush of his fingertips against mine lingered like a subtle ache beneath my skin, fueling my longing for another touch, another stolen glance. I tried to maintain my usual routines, smiling politely, attending social events, but inwardly, my emotions spiraled wildly between excitement and anxiety. Each moment alone felt heavy, as if waiting patiently for something significant to finally unfold. My husband noticed none of my turmoil, his attention consumed by an upcoming business event, a gala that required careful preparation and social finesse. While he arranged endless details about invitations and seating charts, I stood silently beside him, nodding absent-mindedly, my mind elsewhere. He had become so accustomed to my quiet agreement, to my quiet support, that he failed to notice how distant I had truly become. The more he immersed himself in his world of obligations and appearances, the deeper I sank into mine, consumed by secrets that now defined my every breath. Then, without warning, an ordinary morning changed everything. My sister called, suggesting we meet for coffee at a quiet cafe nestled in the outskirts of town. Though her tone seemed casual, a note of tension resonated within her voice, a quiet urgency that sent waves of apprehension through me. My pulse quickened instantly. Deep down, I already knew what our conversation would entail. Still, I agreed, hoping somehow to maintain my composure, to conceal the complexity that my life had recently acquired. The cafe was nearly empty when I arrived. Soft jazz drifted through the cozy space, and the gentle scent of fresh pastries hung sweetly in the air. My sister waited at a secluded table, her expression carefully neutral, fingers lightly tracing patterns across the rim of her coffee cup. I approached, heart pounding louder with each step, trying to mask my anxiety with a casual smile. Her eyes met mine immediately, holding them with an intensity that seemed to pierce through every carefully constructed barrier I'd built. We exchanged a few polite words, but the small talk quickly faded. She leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering to a cautious whisper, asking simply if there was something I needed to share. The directness of her question startled me, and I felt warmth rising in my cheeks, betraying the truth I'd hoped to hide. My gaze dropped momentarily, searching desperately for the right words, something to explain away the silent tension she'd clearly felt between me and my husband's closest friend. In that vulnerable moment, a strange calm settled over me. I took a breath, choosing my words carefully, confessing only that things had grown complicated lately. She listened quietly, eyes softening in understanding, yet remaining cautious and guarded. Though she pressed no further, the delicate tension between us lingered, heavy and palpable. I knew she sensed far more than I'd openly admitted, but out of loyalty or perhaps fear, she allowed me the space to hold back the full truth. Leaving the cafe that morning, my chest felt unbearably tight. The quiet refuge of denial I'd constructed around my feelings was crumbling, leaving me exposed and vulnerable. Yet amid this turmoil, one clarity emerged. Denying my desires had become impossible. The boundaries I'd set so carefully were slipping away, leaving only raw emotions and the undeniable craving to experience again that powerful connection I'd briefly felt in that secluded car ride. Later that evening, back at home, the subtle sound of the front door closing alerted me that someone had arrived. Expecting my husband, I turned casually from the kitchen sink, only to find my breath caught sharply in my throat. It wasn't my husband who stood before me, quietly leaning against the kitchen doorway, but his best friend, his gaze fixed on mine with a quiet intensity one recognized instantly. My pulse quickened, a familiar heat spreading through me. We both knew precisely what his presence meant, and suddenly, I understood there was no turning back. Standing there, watching him silently leaning against the kitchen doorway, the quiet intensity of his gaze made my heartbeat accelerate wildly. It felt as if time had paused, capturing us both in a fragile moment of uncertainty and anticipation. I barely dared to breathe, aware of every sensation, how the subtle warmth of evening sunlight filtered through the window, casting gentle shadows across his features, or the faint scent of cologne drifting toward me, wrapping around my senses. In that instant, everything outside this room ceased to matter. He stepped slowly forward, closing the space between us. My pulse quickened with every deliberate movement he made, and I felt a sudden flush creeping up my neck, betraying my inner turmoil. The silence stretched on, thick with unspoken truths, heavy with the weight of the decision I already knew we both had made. His eyes searched mine deeply, silently asking if I was prepared for what came next, if I understood fully the gravity of this moment. I responded not with words but by holding his gaze steadily, my answer clear in the soft trembling of my fingertips, the rapid rise and fall of my chest beneath the thin fabric of my blouse. When he finally reached me, he lifted his hand carefully, hesitating briefly before his fingers gently brushed a strand of hair from my face. His touch sent a thrill down my spine, igniting a flame within me that felt both forbidden and inevitable. His gaze softened, eyes darkening with emotions we had both suppressed for far too long. Slowly, cautiously, he lowered his head toward mine, and our lips met in a kiss completely different from our first, no longer hesitant or questioning but deliberate, filled with an undeniable intensity, a promise neither of us had yet dared to speak aloud. As we parted slightly, breathlessly, his fingertips lingered softly against my jawline, tracing its delicate contour, sending warmth cascading through my entire body. My mind raced, caught between exhilaration and the painful weight of guilt, yet my body ached only for his closeness. A powerful surge of emotion overwhelmed me, the realization that this wasn't merely a moment of passion, but the beginning of something profound, dangerous, and life-changing. He took a slow breath, stepping back slightly, though still close enough that I felt every subtle vibration of his presence. His eyes studied mine intently, their intensity burning straight into my heart, silently conveying everything words could not. Before leaving, he softly whispered that he had arranged a private weekend for us both. A chance to be away from everything, somewhere we could finally face what was growing between us, without distractions or interruptions. The invitation startled me, and for a fleeting second, fear crept into my heart. Fear of losing the familiar, safe life I had always known. Yet beneath that fear, something stronger stirred. A deep longing for intimacy, for the emotional connection I'd been starved of for far too long. I nodded slowly, agreeing to the trip without hesitation, acknowledging silently that our lives had already irrevocably changed course. When he finally departed, leaving me alone in the kitchen, silence wrapped around me, amplifying the echoes of our forbidden encounter. I stood motionless, fingertips gently touching my lips, still tasting the lingering warmth of his kiss. My heart hammered against my chest, caught between exhilaration and anxiety about what this new path might bring. I glanced toward the empty doorway, picturing him standing there just moments before, feeling again the electricity that had sparked between us. That night, lying beside my sleeping husband, I stared at the darkened ceiling, unable to quiet the storm of emotions within. Each slow breath beside me felt like a painful reminder of the distance separating us, a gap widened by years of subtle neglect, one neither of us had noticed until it was too late. But now, as I faced the reality of what I'd done and the passion I'd awakened, I understood clearly there was no turning back, only forward into whatever awaited me at the end of this uncertain, thrilling road. The days leading up to our planned getaway passed in a haze of anticipation and guilt. Each morning I woke with a tightness in my chest, a mixture of longing and fear that gnawed at me from the inside. My husband remained blissfully unaware, his days consumed by work, his evenings filled with routine conversations that now felt almost surreal. Every time he spoke, his voice seemed to echo distantly, as if I were hearing him through a thick pane of glass. My responses came automatically, carefully measured to maintain the illusion of normalcy, even as my mind drifted elsewhere. I moved through my days mechanically, performing household tasks with a precision that masked the turmoil beneath. I shopped for groceries, folded laundry, and attended dinner parties with a practiced smile. But every quiet moment was filled with thoughts of him, the warmth of his touch, the quiet intensity of his gaze, the unspoken promise of what awaited us. I found myself drawn to the smallest reminders. The soft scent of his cologne lingering on my clothes, the delicate imprint of his touch on my skin. I would catch my reflection in a mirror, and for a moment, I did not recognize the woman staring back, her cheeks flushed, her eyes bright with a secret fire. My husband, perhaps sensing my distance, attempted to bridge the growing gap between us. One evening he surprised me with a romantic dinner at home, complete with candles and soft music. He moved through the kitchen with an ease I hadn't seen in years, his sleeves rolled up, his hands skillfully preparing a meal he knew I loved. I watched him from the doorway, a gentle pang of nostalgia washing over me. There was a time when such gestures had filled me with warmth, when his presence alone had been enough to make me feel cherished and safe. We sat across from each other, the candlelight casting soft shadows on his familiar face. He spoke of our future plans, of vacations and home renovations, painting pictures of a life that seemed both beautiful and suffocating. I nodded along, offering soft responses, my voice betraying nothing of the conflict within me. He reached across the table, his hand covering mine, and I forced myself to hold his gaze, to find the love that had once been so easy to feel. But the warmth that his touch should have brought never came. Instead, I felt a hollowness, a sense of detachment that frightened me with its intensity. That night, as he lay beside me, his breathing slow and steady in the dark, I closed my eyes and imagined another life. A life where my heart raced not from fear but from desire. Where my days were filled with passion and my nights with soft whispers and stolen glances. I thought of our planned trip, of the possibility that awaited me just beyond the safe boundaries of my marriage. It was not merely the promise of intimacy that drew me in, but the hope of truly being seen, of being desired not out of habit but out of genuine need. The next morning I began to pack my bag with careful deliberation. Each piece of clothing chosen with intention, each item a quiet acknowledgement of the path I had chosen. Soft fabrics, delicate lace, the kind of clothes that spoke to the woman I was becoming, a woman unafraid of her own desires. I moved through the room quietly as if the house itself might betray me, the walls too familiar with my secrets. When my husband left for work, offering a gentle kiss on my cheek, I stood still until the door clicked shut behind him. Only then did I allow myself to breathe deeply, to feel the weight of my decisions settle fully onto my shoulders. I checked my phone, reading his message again. A simple address, a time, nothing more. My hands trembled slightly as I typed my response, a single word that would seal my fate. Yes. I knew that from this moment forward, everything would change. The woman I had been would not follow me into this new life, and whatever awaited me on the other side of that door, I had already accepted the cost. The morning of our getaway arrived shrouded in a thick fog, both outside the window and within my mind. I moved through the house like a ghost, every step slow and deliberate, as if I might disturb the delicate balance that had held my life together until now. My husband had left early for a conference call, his absence granting me the space to prepare without the weight of his gaze. His kiss goodbye had been soft, almost mechanical, a gesture of routine rather than passion. I stood at the door long after it closed behind him, the cool metal of the handle pressing into my palm as if tethering me to the reality I was about to abandon. Packing became a ritual. I chose each piece of clothing with care, selecting soft fabrics and muted tones that felt both intimate and comforting. Lace undergarments, a delicate silk robe, the kind of things I rarely wore at home. I wrapped them gently, folding them with the precision of someone performing a sacred act. With every item, a piece of my old self seemed to slip away, replaced by a woman who was ready to embrace the unknown. I left the house quietly, my bag a small, unassuming piece of luggage that betrayed nothing of my intentions. As I walked to the car, I felt the crisp morning air brush against my skin, a sharp contrast to the warmth building inside me. The world outside seemed softer somehow, the usual harshness of the city blurred by the mist. It felt as though I were stepping into a dream, one where the rules of my everyday life no longer applied. The drive to the cottage was quiet. The roads wound through forests and open fields, their gentle curves leading me further away from the familiarity of home. My phone lay face down on the passenger seat, its screen dark. I had silenced it earlier, unwilling to risk the intrusion of reality breaking through this fragile bubble I had created. Each mile brought me closer to him, to the promise of something new, something real. My pulse quickened with every passing sign, every turn that brought his address closer into view. When I finally arrived, the cottage stood nestled among tall pines, its rustic charm amplified by the isolation. The wooden porch creaked softly under my feet as I approached, my hand trembling slightly as I reached for the door handle. It opened before I could knock, and there he was, standing in the doorway, his expression a mirror of my own, a mix of relief, anticipation, and the slightest hint of fear. We stood silently for a moment, the world around us holding its breath. He stepped back, allowing me to enter, the warmth of the cottage enveloping me as the door closed behind us. The room was cozy, filled with soft light filtering through sheer curtains, the kind of light that softened edges and hid imperfections. He took my bag without a word, setting it gently on a chair before turning back to me. His movements were careful, deliberate, as if afraid that any sudden motion might shatter the delicate reality we had constructed. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost hesitant. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his question hanging in the air between us. I met his gaze, my own voice steady despite the tremors beneath my skin. Yes. It was a simple answer, but it carried the weight of every decision I had made to get here. His shoulders relaxed slightly, a soft exhale escaping his lips as if he had been holding his breath since I walked through the door. We moved through the next moments cautiously, the space between us shrinking slowly. His hands found mine, his touch warm and grounding, pulling me gently into this new chapter. Every step forward felt like shedding a layer of my old life, leaving behind the quiet desperation that had filled my days. Here in this place with him, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't known I needed. As the afternoon light shifted, casting golden hues through the windows, I realized that for the first time in years, I felt truly present. Every sensation, every breath, every beat of my heart seemed amplified, sharp and vivid. I had crossed a threshold, and though I knew there would be consequences, they felt distant now, overshadowed by the overwhelming truth that at this moment, I was exactly where I needed to be. The cottage felt like a world unto itself, a sanctuary where time moved slower, each moment stretched into something deeper and more significant. The hours unfolded softly, a gentle rhythm that contrasted sharply with the chaos swirling inside my mind. We moved through the space with a careful intimacy, sharing quiet conversations, the warmth of his presence both a comfort and a reminder of the boundaries we were crossing. We sat by the window as the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the wooden floors. The soft hum of a record player filled the room, a melody that seemed to weave itself into the air around us. His fingers brushed against mine as he reached for his glass, a touch so brief yet so charged that it sent a shiver through me. I looked away, my gaze settling on the trees outside, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The world beyond the glass felt distant, as if we were suspended in a quiet, hidden place where reality could not intrude. He spoke of his life, of the years he had spent moving through the edges of our world, always present yet never fully seen. His voice held a soft vulnerability, a hint of loneliness that mirrored my own. I found myself opening up to him in return, sharing pieces of myself I had long kept hidden. I spoke of the quiet dissatisfaction that had settled into my marriage, not as a dark cloud but as a slow, persistent fog. How my days had become a series of routines, my identity reduced to roles I played: wife, hostess, caretaker, while the woman I truly was faded quietly into the background. He listened with an intensity that made me feel exposed yet safe, his eyes never leaving mine. There was no judgment in his expression, only understanding, a shared recognition of what it meant to feel unseen. His presence became a mirror, reflecting back to me not just who I was, but who I could be. It was a gift I hadn't realized I needed, a soft unraveling of the threads that had bound me to a life that no longer fit. As the evening deepened, he moved closer, his hand finding mine once more. Our fingers intertwined naturally as if they had always belonged that way. The space between us disappeared slowly, a gentle closing of the distance that had held us apart for so long. When he spoke again, his voice was a whisper, a question wrapped in a promise. "Do you want this?" His words hung in the air, delicate and fragile, waiting. I nodded, my breath catching in my throat. "I do." It was more than just an answer to his question. It was an acknowledgement of everything I felt, everything I longed for. A quiet acceptance of the path I had chosen with all its uncertainties and risks. He drew me into his arms, and in that embrace I felt a weight lift from my chest, a sense of belonging that I had thought lost to me. The hours drifted by, marked only by the soft murmur of our voices and the gentle rhythm of our breathing. When the moon rose high, casting silver light through the window, we remained tangled in each other's presence, sharing a silence that spoke more than words ever could. My mind was quiet for the first time in what felt like years, the constant hum of doubt and fear replaced by a serene stillness. As dawn approached, A soft light crept into the room, painting everything in pale hues. I watched him sleep beside me, his features softened by the morning glow. The weight of reality pressed against the edges of this fragile moment, reminding me that our world outside would not remain silent for long. But for now, in this small cottage where time seemed to pause, I allowed myself to exist fully, to breathe deeply, to hold on to the truth that I had found something real, something worth holding on to, even if only for a little while longer. The morning light filtered softly through the cottage window, casting delicate patterns across the room. I lay still, my body wrapped in the warmth of his embrace, our legs tangled beneath the linen sheets. His breathing was slow and steady, a gentle rhythm that seemed to lull the world into a quieter place. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the wooden beams with my eyes, a part of me wishing I could freeze this moment, hold on to the fragile peace I felt here, away from everything else. But reality seeped in through the cracks, an unwelcome reminder of the life I had momentarily left behind. The weight of what I had done pressed against my chest, a dull ache that grew with every passing minute. I carefully slipped from his arms, the cool air brushing against my skin as I moved to the window. Outside, the morning dew sparkled on the grass, a delicate reminder of how fresh and new the world seemed, even when I felt burdened by the heaviness of my choices. He stirred behind me, his voice soft and rough with sleep. "You okay?" His question hung in the air, filled with genuine concern. I nodded, not trusting my voice, my fingers gripping the windowsill as if it might ground me, keep me tethered to something real. He rose, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders as he joined me, his warmth a stark contrast to the chill settling over my skin. "We can stay here," he murmured, his breath warm against my ear. "We don't have to go back." His words were a temptation, a doorway to a different life, one free from the tangled web of obligations and expectations I had built around myself. For a fleeting moment I allowed myself to imagine it. A life away from the carefully curated image of perfection, where I could simply be, where I could breathe. But reality pushed back, the image unraveling as quickly as it had formed. My husband's face flashed through my mind, his gentle smile, the way he trusted me implicitly. I thought of our home, the life we had built together, every memory now tinged with the knowledge of my betrayal. The guilt tightened around my chest, sharp and unyielding, refusing to let me escape into the fantasy that lingered in this quiet, hidden cottage. "I can't," I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath. His hand tightened around mine, a silent plea, but I pulled away, needing space to think, to breathe. I turned to face him, the conflict clear in my eyes. "I have to go back. I can't just walk away." The truth hung between us, raw and undeniable. His expression shifted, a mixture of disappointment and understanding. He nodded slowly, the weight of my words settling over him like a shroud. We moved through the rest of the morning in a delicate dance, packing quietly, our movements careful and deliberate. He helped me with my bags, his touch gentle but distant, as if we were already drifting apart. When the time came to leave, we stood on the porch, the world around us achingly beautiful, a stark contrast to the sadness settling between us. He pulled me into a final embrace, his arms strong and comforting, and I allowed myself to sink into it, to take one last moment of solace before stepping back into my reality. The drive home was long and silent. The roads wound through familiar landscapes, each mile pulling me further away from the world we had created and back into the one I had chosen to leave behind. My phone remained silent on the seat beside me, a reminder of the messages I hadn't answered, the calls I had ignored. The weight of my choices pressed down on me, each turn bringing me closer to the consequences I could no longer avoid. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the house loomed ahead, its windows dark, the front door closed. I sat in the car for a moment, breathing deeply, gathering the strength I needed to step inside. I wasn't sure what awaited me, whether forgiveness was possible, or if the life I had known would fracture irreparably. But as I reached for the door handle, I understood that this was the only way forward. I had to face what I had done, to find a way through the tangled mess of my emotions, even if it meant starting over, even if it meant standing alone.